There we go, right. I can't read all of that. So some text first. After the Second World War, the LCC and the Greater London Council, through the Inner London Education Authority, were responsible for education and were innovative and ambitious in providing London with schools and colleges of further education. I'm going to talk about one of each. And they were done by architects who worked inside the local authorities until 1986. Since then, the architecture has been through changes, neglect, misunderstanding, and in some cases demolition. However, some of the work is inherently good, and particularly these two, which I'm going to talk about this morning. I'm going to talk about Bromley Hall, the smaller one first, and then secondly, West London College, which is the larger college of further education afterwards. Right, to go straight in, Bromley Hall is located where the big red dot is, here on the approach road to the Blackwall Tunnel under the Thames. So on this map of London, which is a very old map, things have changed quite a bit. Canary Wharf, the Dome, and the park, the Olympic Park above. It was, if you go to this side, the site of the building is just by the road there, and those two little yellow roads are here, and it's on a rectangular site that sits in there. Looking from the air, it's a long rectangular site completely surrounded by, these days you can see various forms of industrial building, but the school that went on it was unique in that it was a single-story building, a special school. This is Bob Giles's drawing, which shows what was there before. So it was surrounded then by housing, which has long since disappeared. And you can see that it has rather complicated roofs, and it has little courtyards between individual bits of building. Just to describe this a bit, designed in 1965, built in 67, 68, but with a bit added on in the late 70s. It was a special school for 120 children with physical disabilities between the ages of 5 and 16. So it covered the full range at that time. At this time, children were generally described as being handicapped, and they were educated separately in special schools wherever possible. Initiated by the LCC, it was completed by the GLC, and when they were abolished, taken over by the Inner London Education Authority, and then became something else. Right, I'll move in a bit now and show you how it works. You can see it fills the site with very little. There's a playground at the end, but the building itself occupies this part in the middle. In plan, you entered it from one end, and I'm going to jump to the next drawing, which shows that a bit more clearly. It's planned on one level with pavilions, really, and courtyards. You can see that where you came in, where the red lines are. The yellow lines here are the circulation spaces. So you came in, and in the middle there are the larger rooms, and on either side by age, really, because it covers this wide range of ages, you get classrooms and separate courts for the younger ones and then for the older ones. And then in the middle, the library and a big hall in the middle. The striking thing about this building is the roofs with the courtyards, and there are precedents for this thing, but you can see there the scale. The bit that I'm going to, it's not in too good a state at the moment, but the bit I'm going to concentrate on is this area in the middle here. These two roof lights here are the library with a courtyard outside, and behind there's the school hall. So volumes of different sizes, and the individual size of what's going on is reflected in the roof shape and clear story lighting right through the top. You can see these roof lights that light it from the top. And this is a ground floor level view of the library with the roof lights and the way they opened out to the courtyard. So going round it, these are record photos of what it was like when it first went up. You can see the striking forms there. There you see, that's the main hall in the middle, and these are circulation spaces. They were top lit as well, going through. As a school, It was published abroad. This is a coupe because it's a French drawing showing the main hall, the circulation spaces, and then the teaching spaces, which are done on this small scale. I'll go through these quite quickly. It's now in not too good a condition because it's not been, you can see here, this is a more recent drawing. Actually, it's been vandalized quite a bit. You can see where it's broken here, and there's netting to protect the top here because there isn't a use for it. Those courtyards are a bit larger. There you see the size of how the courtyard and the library fit together. And this is how it is now. This is a joiner photo taken quite recently. And you can see here that it's completely neglected. The paving slabs there are, if I go on, there are the paving slabs there. And that little patch, that's where those trees have grown up. So it's in a bad state. I'm going to explain a bit why it is like it is, the shape it is. It was very influenced by Arne Jacobsen's Munkegård School, which was done in '48 before, where the idea of classrooms was a small outdoor space that learning and being in the open air were important to each other. That again was at that time, people like Bob Giles had picked up on these ideas from abroad, and also the Team 10 people, Alder van Eyck, this is his orphanage. The idea here of the form of a building, the structure, and the roof shape and how you lit it was broken down, and you could move it through. I did have it. Oh, right. The problem with the school now is it's disused, and because of where it is, the surroundings have changed a lot. The local authority, it is listed grade 2, but the local authority have not found a use for it. And in fact, this form of building of this sort are equally adaptable. I mean, the Van Eyck School is now an office building. The form that you saw this in that organization actually affords, you could do a lot of different uses for it. And there's a campaign now up for trying to get that redone and used properly again. That's the first school. The larger one that I'm going to go on and talk about is West London College, Telgarth Road. Here again, the red dot is where it is. Barons Court Tube Station is there, sorry, and the roundabout, Hammersmith flyover over there, Hammersmith Road. It occupies a site which it shares with housing between Telgarth Road and Hammersmith Road to the north. This is an aerial view of that. To locate you again, Barons Court, the tube line, the flyover, Erskine's Ark building, the Hammersmith flyover scheme. So the college, which I'm going to go into in some detail, occupies a site running up here with housing to the rear, designed slightly later. So it occupies quite a large piece of, quite a valuable piece of Hammersmith. The building on it is a substantial, large college, right? Designed in 1973, built 1976 to 81, again by Bob Giles, the same architect. And you can see this is quite a different style, substantial red brick building. Right, this is a ground plan of it here. So you can see, if you can read it, it's fitting at Telgarth Road, Barons Court Tube. The actual building is the dark part here, and it has the housing to the rear. So there are roads running around 3 sides of the outside. The brief for this was for the integration of 3 existing schools into one single building, and to provide quite a wide variety of spaces for different sorts of learning, being a technical college. So it had a variety of spaces in it, and it was also located in a position with transport links to London, so that it had quite a large catchment area. This is before the boroughs took over the running of things. Coming to it here, you can see how it's designed. It's basically formed of 2 C-shaped blocks linked together by two larger ones on the other side, which form a small square in the middle of the building. Access pedestrians is from the roadside and the tube side coming in this way, and access for vehicles is through and underneath. Just to show that again a bit more clearly, here it's a close-up from the overview. So here are the two C-shaped blocks. You can see the curved round spaces, one there and one there. The more rectangular one, which is a gymnasium there, and the central part of it in the front there, and behind the housing that was designed slightly later. Across the road at Tiger, it has these marvelous little studio lodges, so that when you cross the road and as you're entering the building and you rise up, you get a view through the fumes of the traffic that are there, of this fine 19th century housing behind. And the original building that was on there by Waterhouse was a fine building, as you can see in this rather bad photo. There was a campaign to save it when it was there, but it moved out to Barnes, and the new one came in. Right. This is the upper level as you come into it. I've shown here in red what was important to the design of a building of this large scale, which is that it's actually part of the neighborhood, and it had a route through it, which I'm showing you there in red lines, where you come up from Barons Court, you rise up a way and into the middle of the building, where there is a square and piazza in the middle, where the rest of the building grouped around it. There were two other ways of getting in. One from the road over this side, and from and to the housing to the rear. So there was a route through to the back there, through the housing there, and there was also a route from this side through and up to that square there. So as a building, it's locked into the circulation system of the area. And they were designed to come together. This is something that between, if you like, the 60s, when the smaller special school was designed, architects themselves had come out of various influences. The Team 10 people started thinking about how buildings socially fitted within urban structures in particular, and how you put buildings together. They were influenced a lot, again, by Scandinavian architecture. And I'm showing you here a slide of Aalto's, Sanisalto Town Hall, which is up in the middle part of Finland. A very small scale building, a building built for a community of about 3,000 people, which consisted of, if we go to the plan, of a town hall, a library, offices for the town hall, a residential bit for people because it was isolated, who came to see people in the town of Sanisalto, and underneath retail units. And these were grouped around a small square, and to get to the rest of the neighborhood, you had routes in from two sides that ran through the building. And that's a picture of one of the steps going up there. It was designed in red brick, not an international style building. Aalto moved away, having been to Italy, and introduced brick. He introduced using brick and tiles as well. So many of his larger schemes were actually covered in tiles. So not the simple modern movement, international style building. They were much richer in design, and people did pick up on this. In particular, what's interesting, I'm not talking about in detail, but was a bigger building by Aalto, the National Pensions building in Helsinki. This was a building on a triangular site in the middle of Helsinki, part of a road pattern and part of quite a dense urban area. And here it's broken down. I won't go into it in detail because it's quite complicated. It's broken down into various parts that are made out of different shaped bits of building with spaces in between them that relate across to the city around it and had routes through and in. A difficult building to read in drawings. When I went to see it, I met an architect there who said he'd been trying to read the drawings for 12 years and he didn't understand it. And when we got there, we realized how wonderful it was that you had this combination of buildings, the way the spaces were done and the materials used and the route and access through them was to do with human scale and community and getting things together. That, in terms of scale, is nearer what was being thought of in the 60s. And this is a summary that I've thought I had earlier in my slides, but just describing that. But the point I think I want to make here is that architects had this concern in the GLC itself. It dealt with quite a wide range of work that often involved planners and architects together, but there were problems. The Hook New Town, which was something they put a lot of effort into in the 70s, didn't come anywhere. And Thamesmead, the large thing down the outside, the battles between the planners and the architects produced really not the most successful of results. So how you did things at the large scale of a piece of city was a preoccupation by then. And it's probably best summed up by Neve Brown, who described his scheme, which I'm going to show in a second. You wanted to design a whole neighborhood. And whole neighborhoods meant involving a combination of buildings with routes and the things they were in. In London, we had several examples, good examples of this. The Smithson's Economist group of buildings, Alexandra Road by Neve Brown himself, and probably the British Library by Sandy Wilson, are all buildings on an urban scale. Right, just to remind you, the Economist building, 3 buildings of different functions, a bank, an office building and a residential building behind, in a very dense urban site with routes through that made spaces before you entered the buildings of different functions. Neve's housing scheme on a very large scale for housing. If you look at the plan part of it, a railway line running behind which dictates the housing on the north, sheltering it. A new route through quite on a different street scale from an existing street, doing its own thing, but learning from previous things. The British Library, which dealt with being next door to Scott's St Pancras Station, and probably the most Alto-esque building of the ones you've seen there, but not quite with his humane touch, but I mean, it had 8 stories of books to deal with. Back to West London College. Anyway, it was a building of that sort with routes that went through it. I'm going to go into it in a bit of detail now. It was large and complex. This is the lower sort of basementy level of it, which has vehicle access from the road at the side and absorbs quite a lot of the service buildings that you had, but also you can see the variety of sizes of the big C parts are basically classrooms that are different sizes, but it involved a youth club, practical sort of studio places, language laboratories, right inside, so you keep your earphones and concentrate in French, a gym of quite a large size, as well as open spaces, and over on the roadside where the noise was, parking and sports facilities. This is an original photo coming from Barons Court, crossing Talgarth Road. You pass a gable end of those delightful Victorian houses. First thing you see is another gable end. It's the gable end of one of the Cs there, with the entrance there. And this is what that looks like now, with the trees grown up. So you fight your way across the traffic. There was an earlier version which had a bridge that went across. Those things cost lots of money. So you go across and you can see here there's a way in, and that where the fumes are, it's solid brick. Just to show where you are, you've crossed the road here, and you're coming up a ramp here, and there's the entrance into the centre of the building over here. So we'll go on a journey through there, which means going up these steps, again, which shield you and give you a bit of fresh air against the road, and you move on up in through disabled access by means of the ramp up the steps, which you can also gather on, are large in value. Again, it's quite alto-ish actually to do this sort of thing. Till you get to the entrance. Now here is one of the things that's caused a problem. This building is, at the moment, I think it's fairly underused in terms of educational things, but in its life, they've been worried about security. So the entrance was altered, and you now have this part of the way through the building. You have a turnstile, and members of the public or people living behind or anywhere in the neighborhood can't really go beyond this point. And this was done by the later edition, which is quite disastrous and unfortunate. And given as one of the reasons when this building was put in for listing, it being turned down, was that it disfigured it. Well, it's quite an easy thing to actually remove. But originally it was like this. I'm sorry it's such a bad photo, but it does show that the sheer guts and bravado of the architecture here, windows, plain surfaces, route through. Here you walked up there and you can see where you're going, because it's something to see that you're going to. Show that in detail. You're coming through here, large volume on that side and these walls on the side here. There again from the street, showing how awful the other bit of addition was. You go into the courtyard, inside there's a courtyard behind, and that is really quite extraordinary. Here's a view at the top here that when you're in it, you're surrounded. There are these variety of forms that you see. Here, when you're in, this is a rather nighttime photo, but once you come through, the main entrance to the college is there. And there is also the route through on behind, which is now prohibited to the public. And this is overlooked by the circulation routes to the other parts of the college. Just to put it up again, we're in this bit here now. Okay, building. And here is Bob with Tony Caro in that space. And originally there was an Andy Caro. They managed to get an Andy Caro sculpture put in. And there they are lovingly talking about it. Going on through that part, there was the way through out to the rear, where there's another fine set of steps that go down and into the back, which you can see here, but at the moment are cut off and blocked, so you can't go through. An original view from the housing to the rear. So when you come out of the courtyard to the rear, there were steps that run down here. This all looks very blank because this is while the housing was being built. Through and in there, those steps completely cut off, not used at all. In there, blocked off at the end. I'm going to talk about the inside a bit. The picture here is of somebody originally. You can see that the brick here goes on inside. That again, back to San Isalto, was the warmth and durability that you found was something that came through Alto at that time. Perhaps this way of sitting and is he learning or is he waiting to do games? I don't know, but that echoes Van Eyck actually in the sort of things that people growing up need. That is Newton by Blake, who happens to be doing some learning. There, we're now in this entrance hall. You can see that you have different sizes of space related to each other and different things going on. This is next to that piazza where you've just walked through and in. We are now there, bang in the center of the building, and that's where that lad, right, was sitting. He's sitting in that space there. Above that, there were, if I go back, around the entrance, there were quite large student common rooms. One there, one there. The common room being like this. These have actually been filled with partitions and are turned into little offices now. But this is quite an interesting photo now. This is pre-digital laptops. Again, as you move through, you could move through those common rooms, and there's a circular route there that you can join from the wings of the sea. So there is an organic way horizontally that you use this building, and in using it, you have these special experiences as you go around it. Just blowing the rest up, as off on the other side, you can see there are lecture theatres of different sizes that slot in sort of admin things that you get, variety of stuff. That's that entrance hall being used for some other sort of gathering. Above that, the library, again, a big space central that you can get to. That's on 2 levels, and you can see the size of it there. There, you can go up. Within it, there's quite nice bits of tour de force architecture, a nice steel staircase. It spread out. Just to show you in section how the various volumes of different uses you can see are tied into a building that is done in this way rather than a box with things divided up inside it. On the side here, there's a cafeteria part the service kitchen. This, in fact, although it was there for students originally, they now teach catering there, and it is used actually as a learning thing as well, which shows the flexibility of a building like this. Front with car parking. The cafeteria as a cafeteria. On the roadside, lots of light. That's that from the outside, raised up, walls to protect you from the noise. The trees have now grown up. Type of a variety, again, of space within. This is actually in what was originally a youth club. I'm not sure that it's still a youth club. The main thing about it is that you've got different volumes here, different space and circulation that you could use in all sorts of ways. Ordinary sort of lecture theatre, the bricks go on through. Classrooms, well, it's small with aspect outside the park and the greenery that's in there now, but sorry, not in these sort of photos. Going around the outside, there were these original routes that ran through. This is a view of the gable end, I think, of this part here next to the housing. And again, the colour green. This is in the sun. This is this last summer. That's how it was originally with an open space there. This again is the route through from this side to the gable end there. That again is blocked off. If you walk, this is quite recent. If you walk down here, you can't walk any further. And it's a park. Again, between the housing and the rear of the college, a park, but only accessible to people who live there. They're blocked off by a fence on the end. Again, the higher part of the upstairs, when you're circulating at the upper level in the building, you do get these spaces where I showed you the lad sitting in a corner. You can stop and look out. It is a substantial building. This is looking from one side, probably I think at the back of the library with a lecture theatre here. You can see that the robustness with which a quite complicated amassing of spaces is put together and made from two basic simple materials with variations in the I'd show you here a nice technical section for architects. It really is well made and quite adaptable. This, of course, the heating insulation standards have changed since this was built. This wall, it's very easy to upgrade it by putting something on the inside. The way the window relates to the wall, that's only single glazing there, but you can make a thermal break there and add a double glaze thing. I think they've got some secondary glazing already, but you could upgrade very easily with very little trouble the existing building that's there. Again, a view of that being shown well, part of a gymnasium. Beautifully put together. Now, to end my bit of this, I would just talk a bit about what's happening to the site here. Hammersmith and Fulham, who are running this as a further education college, have it as one of 5 sites. They have 5 sites in the west of London that are scattered fairly around, and they're located in various parts of those boroughs. West London College, of course, is the most near the middle and the most near where the land values for residential are high. And they are a bit challenged on their finances. And this building has not been listed, and they've got as far as having a certificate of immunity so that within the next 5 years, it cannot be listed, and demolition could take place. And there is a planning application around basically for demolishing the college and replacing it with what's described as a 7-story educational complex, which I've described this building at length, which is a horizontal building with a great variety and potential for use for education type building, that within a 7-story block, clearly vertical circulation is going to determine how it's organized and put together, although we don't know what they want to do. At the moment, I think it's fairly underused, but it's quite clear at the moment that further education is going to rise up the agenda for our society, but that they would, by this scheme, they'd free up some land and be able to build 468 apartments in 7 different blocks. By the name block, I assume they will go up to a certain height, which will yield some money that would help with their challenged financial situation. I leave you with that image and perhaps a letter. This was in the Evening Standard last night from various people responsible for further education who are extremely keen that we all recognise the needs of that. I think that's the end of my part, Alice, if we want to...
Fantastic. Thank you, Philip. Perhaps if you stop kind of screen sharing perhaps for a little bit.
I think Bob wanted to have, if he was going to speak, a plan up. Can I put up an overall view of the, if I get it, find one of my images of the, what? That one? Then whiz back. Yeah, we'll go back to where we get a good site layout. Would that one do, Bob? Or?
You could go further forward where you have one of the whole site, including housing.
Well, I've got one behind, I think.
You, a little way back.
No, I've got.
Well, that will do.
Sorry, that one. That will do. Well,
have you got one that includes the housing?
Yes, of course. There.
That will do.
That will do, yeah, that will do.
That will do.
Right, yeah.
Can I first correct you on something? At the start, you talked about the perspective of Bromley Hall School. Beautiful drawing. And credit it to me, it wasn't mine. I had done an earlier perspective, but we had a young architectural student in the office, David, I can't remember his surname. And he produced that incredibly beautiful drawing and a whole series of drawings of the courtyards and various parts of the complex. And I tried to contact him recently and discovered that he gave up architecture and decided on a career as an artist and painter. And from the quality of that drawing, you can see he was very wise to do that. Just going back to West London College, what I just would like to talk about is how this layout originated. When the old Waterhouse building was demolished, the group was set up in the GLC to find uses for the site. And they recommended that it's 15 acres. They recommended that it be given over to a park at the top, which is where the old forecourt to the school was. Thank you very much. And then the rest of the site divided pretty much between council housing and the education buildings. And at the time, the local council, Hammersmith Council, were encouraging developers to incorporate pedestrian routes through their sites. And they had a whole network of pedestrian routes, which we picked up on. And I conceived the idea that we would have a pedestrian route through the site, which started up in the park at Hammersmith Road, and then went through the housing as a kind of promenade, and then through the college and across to Barons Court Underground Station in the bottom right-hand corner. And at that time, schools were largely gated and secured, but housing estates were largely open. And so this seemed a concept that could be achieved. One of the things I was concerned about was that we would always have to get across what I think is the access to the A4, eventually the M4 at the bottom, to get to Barons Court underground station. And at that time, there was a proposal for a series of motorways, ring motorways around London, of which this would be the inner motorway. And Targarth Road would be expanded to 4 lanes each direction. And so there was the issue of how to get over Targarth Road. And I certainly didn't want students to have to face the normal staircase climb up 4 or 5 meters. So the concept then developed to a promenade from Hammersmith Road, which gradually rose up as you went through the site, so that by the time you got to the corner opposite Barons Court, you were already 4 meters up. So you didn't have a 4-meter climb. You had this gradual promenade through the site. And then on the other side of the road, there was a steep slope up to Barons Court underground station. So the bridge could arrive pretty much at the level of Barons Court underground station. That was abandoned somewhere in the design development. So suddenly we found ourselves with a promenade which was 4 meters up and having now to get down again, which was the inspiration for this rather grand entrance staircase, which you showed earlier. Sorry. And I suppose in my fantasy, I had imagined that eventually when the landscape had developed, that this could be a very nice Sunday afternoon promenade, that you'd enter the park at the top, you promenade through the housing, gradually rising up until you got to the college, and through the college, over the bridge to Barons Court, down to Queen's Club, and if you have enough money, down to the River Cafe. And by having this climb, you actually solved the problem of security, because the promenade was able to go through at, I think it's level 1 for first floor. So you could secure, yes, that's good. You could secure the ground floor, that was completely private. And to get into the building, you had to climb up from the courtyard, from the piazza there. Unfortunately, somewhere along the line, I think it was largely due to Margaret Thatcher's selling off of council housing, the housing element was developed separately. Initially, there had been within the GLC Architects Department a special group, because if you remember at that time, it was divided into schools divisions and housing divisions, and there the twain should meet. But a special group was set up, and I worked with the housing architect, and we developed a scheme which I had hoped, and she also had envisaged, would be one architectural complex throughout the whole building, throughout the whole development of the site. I don't know quite what happened, but following the government's policy of selling council housing, that became sort of semi-privatized, and I'm not quite sure exactly who owns it now, but the residents or the housing managers then wanted to protect and gate off that development. So we'd actually reverse the situation which we started with, which was we had a gated housing scheme, but we had created sort of free access, public access through our building. And one of the sad things, I think, is that, as Philip showed earlier, the College Administration, quite soon after the college opened, introduced this bridge, this control center where you had to pass through turnstiles to get into the building, and it effectively, and then they also closed off the east-west route, because that was also part of it. There was a north-south route and an east-west route. So the whole site was intended to be open to the public. As a consequence of this gating, the building is not very well known. I think most people who travel down Talgarth Road, coming from the airport, very properly look at the Art Nouveau artist housing on the right-hand side, and don't know that within the complex that we designed, there are these gardens within the horseshoe-shaped buildings and the piazza courtyard. And I think that's a pity, because even if we couldn't have had my fantasy promenade, at least people would have had access into the building. The other critical factor in the design of the building was that initially we were going to take these three colleges, West London College, Hammersmith College for Further Education, and Hammersmith College of Art and Building, and amalgamate them into one administration. But very early on in the design process, the principal of the College for Further Education became very concerned about this amalgamation, and felt that his students who were doing skills and bricklaying and sort of not exactly remedial general education, but they were still doing their O levels and A levels, would be overwhelmed by the proximity of the more sophisticated students who were doing languages and accountancy and all sorts of things in West London College. And they insisted on a physical identity separate from the others. And the essence of the planning of the building stems from that, in that we have essentially three buildings, one of which never came to fruition, but two horseshoe buildings. The one on the right is the Hammersmith College for Further Education, and the one on the left, West London College, and a building that was to be parallel with Talgarth Road at the bottom would house Hammersmith College of Art and Building. My concern, and I think the concern of the principal of the amalgamated college, was that this was a missed opportunity for these students to socialize together. And that prompted me then to create this concourse, which runs around the courtyard, around the piazza. And off that concourse are all the shared facilities, all the common facilities for both and possibly eventually three colleges. So there are the common rooms, the library, the dining facilities, the gymnasium, the games hall. So the two critical things in the design of this were the promenade through the whole site, which welcomed the public in, and the concourse around the piazza, which enabled all students from whatever discipline, whatever age, whatever nationality to meet. And both by failure, I think, to understand how the design works, and for all sorts of other reasons I don't completely understand, Philistinism might actually come into it. Both of those have really been squandered. And as Philip said, the one comforting thing is that the damaging interventions are fairly easily removed. And for example, in the two big common rooms, which you showed photographs of, which have been converted to small offices and small classrooms, possibly. They're all rather flimsy partitions, which could be taken down in a weekend. And the gating off could be removed similarly in a weekend. And what I see as its future is that this should be a critical, wonderful, cultural, social hub for this part of London, this part of Hammersmith. It has so many facilities already. It has such a lot of space and opportunity to introduce additional ones. And perhaps the future is for the college authorities to actually sit down with the Hammersmith Borough Council and just take a more imaginative look at this, and to get, instead of a big commercial architect like Atkins, to get somebody like Tony Fretton, for example, with real sensitivity and imagination to see how this could be achieved. Enough from me.
Thank you, Bob. That's what an extraordinary project, and no, it's one I've driven past lots, and it was a revelation to see the photographs and to appreciate what I hadn't been aware of previously on that site. We have time for some questions, so if anyone would like to ask questions, do please just notify me in the chat box, and I'll hand you the microphone. Could I ask? I mean, I have a memory of watching footage of Anthony Caro talking to the students. I think it's on iPlayer, about the sculpture, which
yes, that is a funny story. Shortly before the building was due to be opened, a few months earlier, the college principal rang me up to say that they were thinking of commissioning a coat of arms to put over the main entrance. And I thought this was a pretty naff idea, but it coincided with an investment in architectural review from the Arts Council, who were volunteering a 50-50 contribution to the cost of commissioning arted public spaces. And I managed to persuade the college to put in some money, and I think we also got some from the ILEA, and talked to the Arts Council about a possible artist. And initially, I was enthusiastic about commissioning Elizabeth Frink to do one of her, what I think she calls goggle sculptures, these great cerebral heads, or a variant on that, with the implication that this great brain would be standing in the courtyard there. The Arts Council thought I should be more adventurous and said, well, what about Anthony Caro? And I said, well, of course I would have gone for Anthony Caro, because I think all architects love Anthony Caro because of because the architectural character, the way he puts elements together is also what architects do. But I thought he would be much too expensive and he wouldn't do it. Anyway, the Arts Council approached him, and at that time, I think he was still teaching at St. Martin's, so he was actually on the staff of the ILEA. He was very reluctant to take any commissions, and the only previous commission he'd taken, because he didn't need commissions. As soon as he did his work, people bought it. The one earlier commission he did was in the east wing of the National Gallery in Washington. And if you haven't seen it, it's a beautiful piece of sculpture. Anyway, somehow the Arts Council persuaded him to take the commission. And he produced this sculpture. I think this is a picture taken on the day the sculpture was unveiled, when the great and the good were there. The following week, the college opened and the students turned up. And on the first day, a student had chained his bicycle to the sculpture. There were no cycle racks, and this was the most secure place. The second day, there were 3. By the end of the week, there were probably about 20 bicycles chained to the sculpture. And at first, Anthony and I laughed at it, and we talked about it being, it's now become kinetic sculpture, changing every day. But then the right-wing tabloid press, I think read by the Daily Mail, I'm not sure if it was a tabloid in those days, got hold of it. And of course, this was something that they could complain about on two grounds. First of all, it revealed that modern art wasn't art at all, really. It was just a pile of old steel junk. And that this was further evidence of waste of public money, in that it had been paid for partly by the Arts Council and partly by the ILEA. And that prompted the college to organize a meeting with the students. The students were also opposed for different grounds. They thought the money could have been used to subsidize meals in the college canteen. But we had that meeting, which was excellent. And Anthony explained what it was all about. Although I think he remained slightly sort of hurt by it. But there you are.
I lived for 3 years in Robinson College in Cambridge, which I think is a building almost exactly contemporaneous with this, and perhaps has some characteristics in common. The kind of, particularly the organisation around a route. And I know Gillespie, Izzy Metstein and Andy Macmillan sort of were very resistant to suggestions that Alto had been a presiding influence over that project. How did you, when you heard Philip make some suggestions about the influences on the project, are they ones that you would acknowledge?
I certainly would acknowledge. I certainly acknowledge the Alto one. I'd actually been to Finland a year or two before I got the brief for this, and I'd been to see the town hall and been I greatly admired the building. So I think that influenced me. I'd had a long interest in Scandinavian architecture anyway, and Bromley Hall is greatly influenced by Arne Jacobsen's Munkegård School. I first went to Copenhagen in 1958, I think, as a student, and then went back regularly and acquired a Danish wife by 1965, and have been going back probably every year since. What I did resent was when English heritage and later the advisors, the consultants that got to make their case for demolition, that they seemed to be obsessed with the idea that I was more influenced by Jim Sterling. And of course I knew Jim Sterling's work, and of course I was bowled over by it. But I wasn't conscious of the influence. And it was painful for me that that this was such a superficial connection, largely because I'd used red brick, red engineering brick. Well, I'd used engineering brick on Bromley Hall 10 years earlier. And I'd used engineering brick because my knowledge of construction wasn't that wonderful. And I knew engineering brick was intrinsically a damp-proof course. So, that was a great start to keeping the damp out of your building. And so this reference to the Jim Sterling influence, I think it's an indictment actually of the people who made that connection. And the only connection, I've got a note here, the only connection with Jim Sterling, which I appreciate, was in Private Eye's Nooks and Corners, And at that time, it was written by John Betchman's daughter, Candida Lysick Green. And she wrote a very complimentary nooks and corners. You don't get very many complimentary nooks and corners. But she ended by saying, if the GLC architects can come up with something like this, why does anyone bother to employ Jim Sterling? Now that's a connection with Jim Sterling I'm quite happy to accept, but not much more.
We're getting some questions in. I've got Seneca. I'm going to give you the microphone.
Yeah, hi, Bob. Thank you for your lecture, and you and Phil. I just want to know the impact of the ILEA, especially now in the situation where a lot of the NEU, the teachers' unions, are looking at new ways of implementing further education. I just want to know your what that relationship was with the GLC and the ILEA.
Well, it was a wonderful relationship because the ILEA controlled all of the schools and colleges. Their headquarters was also in County Hall, and they briefed us. But I think there was mutual respect in that they were the experts on education, and we were the architects, and they didn't interfere with us, and we largely took what they advised us as being the correct advice. It was sort of mutual. It's interesting that we hope, our supporters in the campaign to save the building is Michael Gove and his wife. And what I find hilarious, of course, is Michael Gove dismissed experts during the Brexit campaign. But at County Hall, we had real experts. We had, in the early days in the LCC, we had the names of the architects that passed through the LCC. It was like a roll of honor of the profession. And similarly, the people who were in charge of education. I think it's sad that it's all been fragmented.
I've just got a message from Bryn Davis that he'd like to add something on this topic. Bryn, I'm going to unmute you.
Yes, I just want to say something. For my sins, as they say, I was a member of the GLC stroke ILEA from 1980 to 1985. And for 2 of those years, I was the leader of the ILEA. Unfortunately, this was sort of past the glory days of architecture schools, because by that time we were managing significant decline in pupil roles rather than building new schools. There was lots of work to be done adapting the schools for this change. So unfortunately, I wasn't part of the ILEA when it was looking at building these wonderful buildings. But the ethos that was set, there was this concept of the seamless road. They saw education as a total service, not split between different functions, but providing a comprehensive service. And I think Hammersmith College is a sort of epitome of that approach. This was bringing together what had previously been separate institutions, bringing them together, and in doing so, creating something more than just adding them together. So I think that was the educational concept at that time that drove the construction of this building. I have to say, this is now 40 years later, and I'm not as involved in education as I was at that time, so I don't really want to get involved. One would have thought that faced with the need for additional space with social distancing, the building like this which does appear to have the space, would be ideal to meet these new needs. So my involvement with education is much less now, but we really appreciated. I remember that the Hammersmith College was the sort of the physical example of the sort of service we wanted to provide. I have to add that the dominant feature of these buildings and the others is bricks. And wearing a different hat on the GLC, I remember attending, I have no idea what the organization was called, but it was an association of brick manufacturers, and they awarded a prize to Hammersmith College for the best use in a particular year of bricks. I don't know if you remember that, but there was a little presentation, and I had to go along and receive a prize on behalf of the GLC. But just the ILEA, of course, was a much bigger organisation than the organisations now backing, and the college and perhaps had a much broader concept of what education consisted of. Thank you.
And just we have Sean McIntosh. Sean, I'm just going to unmute you.
Thank you. Yes, I was just thinking about the process of onshoring in relation to Brexit and so on, and the requirement to train people up as apprentices. And it seems to me West London College would be a wonderful site for that process of retraining and development.
Well, you're absolutely right. And the case at the moment for demolition is entirely related to the financial difficulties the college is in. And I do think it's sad that the college is able to make these decisions in order to resolve its financial problems, rather than this be a problem for the wider community, to look at what kind of skills and training are we going to need. Post-Brexit, is there going to be a greater demand? I mean, I think generally in educational circles at the moment, there's a lot of acceptance that there is need to improve that sector of education. And just going back to Bryn's point, I think one of the saddest things about the demise of the ILEA and of the architects department was that when some of these terrible destructive actions were taken, in the way that the site was gated, that the whole concept of a circulation which enabled all the students to socialize, there was no wider reference, no wider point for information. I mean, I can't imagine that some of the terrible things which have happened over the last 40 years would have happened if the college was still in the control of the ILEA and there's still an architects department. And those suggestions have been put back to both those bodies for comment. And I think both bodies would have immediately pointed out the fact that they totally counter the whole way the design was developed and the whole way it was intended that the building should function.